Apple Knocker Radio.
When we're talking about the spiritual development of man, we are talking about something that is invisible in its essence, but which affects the world. A spiritually enlightened person will make an impact on the world, even if you can't see the wind that blows in the sail. So the use of alchemical imagery, I think, is a legitimate aspect of the history of the science. All these phases of alchemy have something to say. They may not say any, they're not saying much about how to dye a statue gold or silver, or how to change its color, etc. They're not saying much about that, if anything at all, and they probably wouldn't understand that. But they've caught on to this idea of nature as a divine analogy. There's a very famous book with that as a title, written in the 18th century, which was a huge hit with religious and pious people.
Greetings, my friends. I hope you are all doing well. My next guest is a gentleman that I've long dreamed of chatting with. Tobias Churton is one of the world's most prolific authors on the subjects of religion, spirituality, and esotericism. To date, he's produced nearly 30 books on these subjects. Today, we're discussing his most recent book, The First Alchemists. It traces alchemy from its mysterious appearance in ancient Egypt through its evolution from a set of techniques for commerce to its applications as a set of spiritual concepts. Along the way, Churton slays some sacred cows of alchemy, including Carl Jung's interpretations or misinterpretations, and the nature of the Philosopher's Stone itself. And so, with no further ado, here is Tobias Churton on his book, The Last Alchemist, which I heartily recommend to anyone interested in these subjects. Thank you very much, my friends. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
So, man, I read your book. Wow, it covers so much information. It's incredible. I guess, well, my first question would be, so you mentioned in there, you compare alchemy to a Gordian knot of confused history that you felt compelled to unravel. And so I'm curious, you also mentioned later in the book, which I really like, about how if you look up on Google what alchemy is, the definition is woefully inadequate, and how most of these definitions out there are inadequate or sometimes just inaccurate. So you, having slayed so many of these sacred cows of alchemy, how would you now summarize alchemy to somebody who's never heard of it before?
I'd say that alchemy began as metallurgical chemistry, and the understanding that it was rooted in industry was forgotten over the centuries, and a lot of its ideas were turned into symbolism and then into a kind of fantastic, in the old sense of the word fantastic, i.e. a fantasy of a magical transformation. And while it had a great deal to contribute to the beginnings of scientific chemistry, sadly, at the point that scientific chemistry became of great interest to intellectuals in Europe in the 16th and 17th century, and broke through as a separate science in the 18th century, at that very point, alchemical traditions became dislocated entirely from science, and so it became even more redundant, and a new level of incomprehension was attached to it, whereby science would look down on alchemy as being a product of superstitious ignorance. But it starts as a product of enormous ingenuity and inventiveness in the human mind.
Yeah,
that's not a definition, is it? That's really describing a process, because I don't think there isn't a single definition for alchemy, because it's the perception of it changes over different ages. So you would have to define it in terms of a period. So you'd say late antique alchemy in the late Roman Empire was metallurgical chemistry, with often expressed using symbols. And then it becomes more symbolic, except in Arabic alchemy, where the leading exponents were actually investigating and experimenting with the production of acids and alkalis and its use in medicine. And then it changes again. And then there's a kind of Masonic or Rosicrucianist alchemy. And then you've got, in our era, you've got this psychologizing of alchemy by Carl Jung, which unfortunately I read about and influenced me too much for many years. I rather regret reading Jung's Psychology and Alchemy without the technical knowledge that I acquired later. But you know, you've got to start somewhere.
Right.
Now you can start with my book.
Well, it definitely is a great launching point. That was actually, I had a question about the Jung, what you say about Jung, because that is, I think largely because Jordan Peterson has kind of resurrected Carl Jung's work in a lot of ways for people. I think a lot of what people understand about alchemy is from Jung. And you point out that to my interpretation of your writing, he misinterpreted some previous writing about dreams.
Yes, I think he made too much out of the fact that part of the record of Zosimos of Panopolis, who lived around 300 AD, Common Era, he used the literary convention of a series of dreams to describe changes within substances, and Jung, in my view, misunderstood what he was reading and thought that Zosimos was actually writing down his own dreams. And I think he regards these dream passages as very significant historical records, some of the earliest detailed descriptions of people's dreams, which for Jung became a teaching point about the nature of the unconscious. So he didn't seem to grasp at all that Zosimos knew exactly what he was doing, that he was using a literary convention. I think Jung came to altogether the wrong conclusion. He said that the alchemists projected their unconscious onto their chemical work. In other words, the alchemists or chemists, I would say, or operators, didn't realize that they were seeing changes in mercury and tin and gold and silver and so forth, and they were making them meaningful without realizing what they were doing. I don't think that's true at all. Jung, of course, has given us this word projection, which is taken straight out of alchemy. A projection simply means an ingredient. So if you project something in original chemistry, it simply means you've added an ingredient. Now he took the word projection as being something that the mind maybe automatically imposes on a perception, and he was trying to say that in that sense that people's experience of chemistry was turned inside out by the activity of the unconscious. But if you really go into it, you realize you can't do that. You'd have to say then that any activity that we do was a projection of the unconscious. So making dinner could become a profound revelation on that basis, or cooking eggs. And he failed to see that because he took it for granted, again mistakenly, that very often the practitioners didn't have a conception of what they were doing with the ingredients in their crucibles or in their aludels, or what was happening with distillation. And there's absolutely no evidence at all that they were mystified by what they were doing. They were no more mystified by it than a sword maker was mystified by tempering steel. Once they'd learned how to do it and they'd read the recipe and the recipe worked, it wasn't a mystery. And I think he remystified alchemy. Now that appeals to a kind of post-60s mentality, the idea of a mystification that carries a hidden truth or an elusive meaning. I mean, that's people would say, for example, that the Beatles, for example, there was an alchemy in the group, which is another way of saying there was a mystery about how the four personalities work together as a musical and as a phenomenon. And you can use the word alchemy in that way. But that's again is mystification. I wanted to penetrate this aura of mystery which has surrounded the subject, not because I'm object to mystery, but very far from it. A mystery means something that the more you go into, the more you discover. But some things we mystify at our peril. We're losing reality. We're losing important realities by mystifying them. I mean, the whole subject of what I've spent my adult life in researching and developing in the whole field of esoteric wisdom is packed with real mystery and at the same time a hell of a lot of mystification. And I want people to be able to pick up a book, and if they're really interested, work out what it is, what these things really are, you know. And the same goes for religion, doesn't it? I mean, if you take the mystery out of religion, for many people, there's nothing there. There's nothing left. So the life of Jesus is a mystery, and so on. Now, I dare say there is truth in this, but there is also a hard reality as well that we shouldn't miss. You know, it's I do understand the urge for mystification, but it leads to some extraordinary diversifications of energies. I'd put it that way. And so the occult and esoteric worlds tend to be very guarded about their separation from other fields of knowledge. Aleister Crowley was very interesting to me because he brought what was called in those days the occult into the field of science, and was looking for a science of the spirit, a demonstrable knowledge. In other words, if you do certain things happen. And if you can show that this happens all the time, if you do certain things, you have science. It's not a mystery anymore.
Well, that's like Steiner too. He stressed that applying the science of spirituality, applying a scientific mindset to looking into mysticism and matters of the spirit. Whether or not he achieved that himself, I guess, is up for debate. But he did it. I just listened to a bunch of lectures where he talked about the importance of applying scientific method to spirituality, which I thought was an interesting concept.
Yes, he called it what he did spiritual science.
Right.
Well, why is it spiritual science? Why isn't it just science? But yes, he tried to. What he was saying, I think he was trying to bring a kinship between science, which for many people was threatening in the 19th century, because very often it's not the science, it's the theories behind the science that cause the problems. Nobody objects to people doing experiments in physics and chemistry. They object to the conclusions that some scientists come to, which they say underpin those things. And science had become threatening to spiritual ideas and spiritual beliefs, certainly by the end of the 19th century. And Steiner, in his usual irenic and harmonious attitude, wanted to bring these together, which was, of course, also the aim of Madame Blavatsky and Olcott and the Theosophists. And of course, Steiner was a Theosophist. Crowley also knew a lot about Theosophy. He never joined the order, and he didn't like many of the Theosophists he encountered. That's certainly not all, but most of the people he encountered later had been seriously into Theosophy, including the founders of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. So he always regarded Blavatsky as a pioneer, but had little time for Blavatsky's followers. But this interest in science and its relationship to magic is fascinating in itself. And we mentioned Jung, and Jung, of course, was trying to produce a science of the mind, psychology. And a lot of occultists today, or people sympathetic to esotericism, always like to throw in a bit of science, to say, as science has shown, da 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 dum, and they can throw a little bit of science. They feel that if they could just let the word science appear, it makes their beliefs more respectable.
Right.
you know, it's. I was thinking of Pico della Mirandola, the great philosopher of Renaissance Florence in the 1490s and 1480s, particularly, because he didn't live to see much of the 1490s. He in one of his condemned theses, that's th, not f, one of his condemned theses that the Pope forbade, he said that Jesus worked his miracles through magic, which one day human beings in general would be able to discover the science of, the knowledge of. So he was kind of predicting that a lot of things that looked magical only looked so because we were ignorant of the forces involved. And it's very, there's so many ramifications of these thoughts. Any child who sees something it can't immediately understand immediately thinks it's magical in some way. And as we get older, we get a bit more cynical, and the world becomes disenchanted. And this is one of the great mental problems of the minds of people in the world, not just in the West, but now in the East as well, very much so, is this feeling of a disenchanted world. The enchantment's gone out of it. We're faced with a materialism. Appearances count hugely. Any twit who sings a song or appears on television is called an icon. Now, the word icon the word only means image anyway. That's the Greek word, icon, image. But it is used as an alternative to the word famous, of somebody acquiring notoriety or is recognized in some way. But it's fascinating that this icon idea is being foisted on more and more worthless characters. And certain images are called iconic. Well, that's only literally you're saying an image is an image is an image. The first lesson of the prophets of the Old Testament was don't worship images. So why are we worshipping images? Because in a way we're trying to, if we look at it in Jungian terms, people are projecting a lost enchantment onto material images. And so the need for magic is never going to go away in that sense. But it helps if you understand what you're doing when you do these things, when you project enchantment. I mean, Andy Warhol was fascinating because the way he used his experience of Catholic iconography to paint these portraits, which he was doing in the 70s, of repeated portraits of Marilyn Monroe, 60s and 70s, Marilyn Monroe, Elizabeth Taylor. And he's kind of implying that today's religious imagery is a commercially reproducible product. And there's a wonderful irony in that. And he's playing with the word icon in that sense. But of course, the media, being perennially thick-headed, simply take the word icon and misapply it now to practically anything. Oh, the iconic photo. Oh, the iconic image. Oh, the iconic band. Oh, the iconic song. Oh, please, enough. Away with your images. Tear them down. So alchemy has an image, and I've tried to tear the image down and reveal something far more astounding and stunning, which is lost knowledge of what I call in the book a minor industrial revolution going on in Upper Egypt in the Roman period after 30 BC, after the death of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and when the Romans took over Egypt and held it for 300 or so years. with some intermittent periods. And these people, very intelligent Egyptians, were entering a field of chemistry that was previously undeveloped. And a lot of that has to do with the technology that was available and their use of it. I was surprised to find in my studying the subject that glass blowing, if you ask somebody, well, when do you think glass blowing first occurred? And people, glass blowing, creating long glass vessels and so forth. And I'd have thought it was very ancient. I'd have thought it went back a long way, because I think of ancient vases and things like that. One imagines that they always existed. Well, it turned out that glass blowing only appears in the 1st century BCE, again around the time of Cleopatra, Mark Antony, and Herod the Great, the famous Herod of the Christmas story. And the earliest examples of glass were found in Jerusalem. Of glass blowing were found in Jerusalem, which is also fascinating, because there's a strongly Jewish element in the development of what was later called alchemy in Egypt. There were Jewish communities all over Egypt, and indeed until 73, I think 73 or 74 AD, there was a Jewish temple in the Nile Delta. And I don't mean a synagogue, I mean a temple on a par when it was founded with in the 2nd century BC, on a par with Jerusalem, and it was still there. We know precious little about it, but it was obviously important. And it's very interesting. You have the story of Jesus when Herod the Great threatens the line of David, which is perfectly credible story. According to the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is taken to Egypt for safety, and people don't really ask why Egypt, why not Syria, why not one of the Arab countries around, or somewhere else. There was plenty of places it could have gone, but this notion that you went to Egypt for a different Jewish experience to what was available under the reign of Herod the Great in what was Palestine, as the Romans called that area, Judea, more specifically, land of the Jews. The Jewish technological input seems to be very significant. I was delighted to learn about a lady who later became known as Mary the Prophetess, or Mariam. She's a Jewish woman living in Alexandria, and she is credited by Zosimos, who is probably the greatest exponent of the techniques we know about. He defers to Mary on many occasions, says she is the one who explains to us what distillation is. She developed apparatus. She was a real original. And you have to ask the question, well, then why were, and she was not the only woman. I would say that in terms of the names of operators of this craft and art, the most noble and holy art, as they call it, women almost dominate. They don't dominate, but they're on an equal par with the male operators. So we hear about Paphnutius the Virgin, was another operator who Zosimos ridicules. Theosebia, perhaps a God-fearer, meaning a non-Jew who's attached to the Jewish faith, and Mary herself, and another lady called Cleopatra, not the Elizabeth Taylor version, but I think this gives us a big clue to where this activity we later call alchemy resides, and it belongs in the world of textiles and ornamentation. Zosimos isn't called Zosimos of Panopolis for nothing. Panopolis, even today, and it's now called Akhmim, Panopolis was famous, and as then and now, for textiles. And dyeing is what the craft is really all about. You are making dyes. So when they talked about making gold and making silver, you are talking about the development of dyeing technologies to make things look gold or look silver or look like an emerald. So they would dye stones and it would look like lapis lazuli or gold or emeralds or rubies. Now, in another way, you could say they were faking. These were counterfeiters. And I'm sure there must have been operators who convinced themselves or tried to convince others anyway that they had actually made the gold. The tests for gold at that time were quite basic, and if you were really smart, you could outwit the test, and people would take a chemical compound for gold. But of course, the interesting thing is gold was not the most valuable thing in the world.
Right. That was an interesting thing that you speak about in the book.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the scale of values of the Roman Empire were that things that had been made and developed by man were more valuable. In other words, if they showed real artistry, that's what gave the product its value. So people would pay gold or silver coins for an art object, as they do today. So this idea that if you could make gold, you would have unlimited wealth and this sort of thing is really a misunderstanding. If you were good at this art, you acquired a lot of gold or silver. You became rich. Zosimos is quite plain that if you're a good, he didn't use the word, I keep saying, but we're going to use the word alchemist. If you were good at it, you would become very rich indeed. There's the story that John of Antioch tells that in the reign of Diocletian, which is in the 3rd century AD, Diocletian was concerned about the money that rebels in Egypt were getting and attributed it to alchemy, and he had all the books in alchemy, he ordered them all to be burned, which is quite credible. Now, if they had actually been making gold, he wouldn't have had the books burned. He would have acquired them for himself and made sure that every alchemist was working for him in Rome. He wouldn't have suppressed this knowledge. The fact is that this art was so lucrative that they had money to spare to give to, or he believed, to give to rebels. So it was funding rebellion. Another interesting aspect of the history there. And I think something must have happened to the books on alchemy, because we have so little left, such that by the 7th century, I think, when they start, the Byzantines in what's now today Istanbul, was then Constantinople, started to acquire alchemical literature. It was regarded most of all as philosophical. It was of interest to philosophers and religious men, and it became the province of monks and the church. So that something must have happened between 300 and 700, apart from the collapse of the Roman Empire, for people to not really understand the setting of these recipes, as they're called, hundreds of alchemical recipes. The word recipe is also interesting, isn't it? Because again, you've got women dominating. Well, they dominate the textile industry as they do today, and cooking, of course. So the real word, the meaning of kumia or kumia, which is the word that they used, the Greek word is kumia or chemia, seems to be. You can stop me anytime, by the way, because I fear I'm rambling. But anyway, the meaning of is as far as I can tell, to do with blackening and dark and roasting. And the Hebrew word is very similar to the Egyptian word and the Mesopotamian word for dark. Yeah, it's the art of roasting. It really means let's be clear that this kumia, the origin of our word chemistry, kumia, chemia, is the art of heat. It's the art of roasting. It's what happens as if you heat a thing enough, it becomes black. That's the first effect that we really recognize substances is the blackening. Likewise, if you left the body out in the sun, and the sun is in the south, and it goes black. Carbonization. They were fascinated by this idea that while on the first level, roasting a thing could effectively, apparently destroy it, it also has other huge range of other possibilities, that if you apply sufficient heat to certain substances, that substance changes and becomes something else. And the color, which is what they're looking at, they're really interested in, the color changes. And they're fascinated by these color changes of what happens with certain substances. And that's really what it's about. That's the art. It's the art of transforming color. And in other words, dye making.
At some point, it did, obviously, with Zosimos. I think it began at Zosimos, but if I remember correctly, where it began to become a little more abstracted. And that's when it began to become more like into the spiritual aspects. And then you write specifically about how Gnostic thought and alchemical thought influenced each other. Or actually, you suggest it was more the Gnostics taking alchemical processes, which were industrial and commercial, and making them spiritual. Is that correct?
No, I think I don't. That's too simplistic.
Okay.
I think there's a real interaction, and it's absolutely obvious from the. I was very happy to translate into English many for the first time in this book, a whole load of documents which have never been in English before, and showed that Zosimos's thought, while he's red hot, so to speak, on the chemical and scientific aspect of the operation, he himself understands it through a prism of Gnostic ideas, among other ideas. He's very much absorbed ideas from Jewish prophecy and Jewish ethics, and Jewish history, very much so, including the Book of Enoch, which is another fascinating aspect. But he seems to be aware of some of the heretical ideas that we have seen from the Nag Hammadi library, the so-called Gnostic library of Upper Egypt. And there seems to me to be a complete atmosphere. There's something was going on culturally in Upper Egypt particularly, but also in Alexandria, and with relatives in Syria as well. But there's something very exciting happening in the 2nd and 3rd century, where you're getting the development of these so-called Gnostic Gospels at the same time as the height of alchemy. Now this is a very, you've got it. I'm trying to think of an interesting parallel, and the first one that comes to my mind, and there could be, there's quite a few others, but the one was the 1960s, where you get a huge amount of technological creativity bound up with an atmosphere of philosophical exploration. The quintessential, I mentioned earlier, the Beatles, the quintessential, they kind of exemplify that you have the making of something, the making of music, and you also the making of an image, and the fascination with pictures and the power of imagery. At the same time, you have all that technology. You've also got the philosophical interest in Gnostic ideas again, and in so-called Indian philosophy, and all of that is all in a huge mix with mythology, religion, different religions, and so on. And I think you've got something, a kind of proto movement of that in Upper Egypt at this time, because all of the documents that are key to our understanding of early alchemy are found in the Thebaid, which is the area around Thebes. And it so happens that nearly all our early Gnostic literature is also from that precise area and from the same period. Now, this has not really been remarked upon, still less explored. It's also the area where we find the earliest copies of the Gospels and religious writings, some of which were not included in our Bible, some of which were. It's clearly there was some kind of atmosphere of daring and almost reckless thinking going on in this area, which suggests that there was a lot of money about, because whenever there's a lot of money, people become freer with their thinking very often. You know, if there must have been a period of great confidence. And because one thing, Irenaeus, who was Bishop of Lyon in 180 AD, complained about what he called the so-called Gnostics, was that they were original. He regarded it as the great error was that they were original. They had originality. They come up with theories for the whole universe. And in one of their writings, the Gospel of Philip, as we call it, God is compared to a dyer. And it also says that Matthew was a dyer, someone who dyes, makes colors, dyes textiles or dyes stones. And he then compares in the writing baptism, the idea of baptism as a form of dye. And therefore the most perfect dye is Christ. Once you are dyed in that, you are well dyed, it's a permanent dye, right? So that very interesting use of dying as a metaphor for the transformation of the soul is in the Gnostic Gospels. It's also in Zosimos, he says not only is this great art to make all the different colors, he's very specific. He said, don't stop with gold and silver. We want every kind of color represented through this art. That's what we're all about. At the same time, he's giving the techniques connected with that. He's saying, but you will miss everything if you don't also recognize that these processes we're dealing with tell us something about the way God makes the universe. And then you get into some very interesting territory, because he takes from the writings of Mariam, the prophetess. She was called that, by the way, because she said God had taught her everything she knew about alchemy, about chemistry. And she's quite specific that it's for her originality was the product of revelation. God revealed this knowledge to her. God showed her the way. God is the light. And now this is really quite a fascinating area, which I go into in the book in several chapters. And I'd rather people read the book than listen to me just talk about it, because the detail is telling. It's transformative knowledge. I find those passages, I can read them again and again, and I'm getting more off them all the time. Zosimos is comparing Mary's description of what she calls the bodies. When she refers to bodies, she means tin, copper, iron, and then there are the incorporeals, not bodies. These are substances usually soft or liquidy, or which disappear in alchemical processes and can be evaporated. And she talks about that you have to, and she then says the bodies are male, and the incorporeals, or spirits as she calls them, interesting again, you've got body, spirit, dualism, have to become one. As the male and the female. So the incorporeal is called the female, and you've got passages in the Gospel of Thomas, unless the male and the female become one, all of that, you've got that idea. So the mystery of the Gospel of Thomas, I suspect, is taken from an observation of alchemy, or it's the other way around, and they have been applying Gnostic ideas to chemical processes. Either way, it's clear that for some period in late Roman Upper Egypt, it was impossible for the best practitioners to separate spiritual knowledge from what they would call what we call material knowledge. In other words, they were one. Right. The doing alchemy was a spiritual discipline for those who saw it that way. And Zosimos is fascinating again, because he then warns against taking this divine analogy of spirit and matter too far. He says there are many alchemists who believe they have to placate the demons. It was believed practically everywhere at this period that the material universe, the creation, was governed by demons. There were the decans. Every minute of the day had its own demon, and there were sort of good demons who interchangeable with the idea of angels. And then, of course, there were also wicked demons who inhabited the dark places of earth. And they get that idea out of the Book of Enoch, which was an important Jewish text, and clearly had a lot of currency in Egypt for a long time. Seven copies of the Book of Enoch were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is, that fact alone is revolutionizing our perception of the importance of the Book of Enoch. Wow. Zosimos seems to be totally familiar with it, and he attributes the teaching of alchemy originally to these rebel angels who've fallen. You can read about them in Genesis chapter 6, who've fallen out of heaven for their lust for human women, and by the product of that lust is, according to the Book of Enoch, a series of giants. And when God destroys the giants in the great flood, because their fatherhood, their paternity was from heaven, their spirits remain, which is why they have to be, when they're punished, they have to be in an everlasting lake of fire, because the spirit can't die. So if you want to punish an evil spirit, this is where this idea of all bad people would be put in a lake of fire forever. It's not, they're not being tortured eternally because they're bad. The theory was that because the evil spirit cannot actually be totally destroyed, the only thing you can do with it is to keep it in this lake of fire forever.
That's fascinating.
So that itself is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
And because of course, people who read the Book of Revelation, I know in America that's millions, and whose religions almost is totally influenced by that one. I think George Bernard Shaw called it the Judas of the New Testament. But anyway, that's an opinion. If you understand the Book of Revelation in terms of the Book of Enoch, you start to get to what it's really all about. And it isn't about eternal punishment of the sinner in quite the way that the Catholic and Protestant religions have been portraying it for centuries, which does make God into a kind of sadist who takes pleasure from the evil done to the evil. It's justice, because there's umpteen prophecies which speak of a God who's merciful and who doesn't say an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and so on. Though back to the demons, Zosimos says these people who evoke demons and feel that they can't do these processes without demonic help, said what you're actually giving your soul to these entities, and they will always trick you, and they will not give you the right dies. And he then attacks the Egyptian temple religion, which is also fascinating. And he says that these statues that people worship, these are the product of misplaced chemistry. And because they've been made with the help of demons inhabit these statues, and to worship them is to fall into sin, and fall into error. Now that's also interesting, because people have thought, and some scholars still hold the view for some reason, that Zosimos was a temple priest. I don't see him as that at all. I see him as a freelancer whose comments about the temple system are almost universally critical. And he said that the temples had the knowledge of chemistry, but they either kept it to themselves or abused it. And he seems to be advocating a kind of an independent spiritual context in which the chemistry finds its flower, in which it can flower and develop and grow. And
prior to Zosimos, it seems like it was a purely commercial industrial art, as far as the records indicate. Is that correct?
We can say with certainty that our earliest documents of alchemical chemical recipes are entirely practical, practical, and those are contained in two sets which are related. One's called the Stockholm papyri because it was bought by one of the great institutions of Sweden, and the other is the Leiden papyri, which was bought by Leiden University Museum, and that's where these papyri now are. But they were found in the Thebaid. They date from around late 3rd century, maybe very early 4th. It's impossible to date them absolutely, but around the time, funnily enough, of Zosimos. But the sources go back to probably the 1st century AD, so Jesus, Paul time, Caligula time, Tiberius, that period.
In those earliest records, how complete did it appear to be as a industrial method, or however you want, as a science, however you want to say it? Was it like very rudimentary compared to the developments, or in those earliest texts did it seem to be a workable science, if we could use that term?
Yeah. It's a workable science, and they are recipes. If you want to make gold, you do this. Again, I must emphasize these passages about making gold were misunderstood later as meaning that they were actually transmuting lower metals into higher metals. They were not doing this. They were trying to make gold color or effective gold dye.
The whole Philosopher's Stone, that's what most people know. That was one of the things that amazed me most when I read your book, was like, wow, that's like the sacred cow of alchemy. And turns out that it was completely false.
It's a complete misunderstanding of certain passages, mostly in Zosimos's work. He refers to a summer stone, and another passage he will refer to the stone which is not a stone. Well, I would imagine he's describing Mercury, the stone which is a great mystery, the great mystery. Right. Because as depending on the temperature, whether mercury is a solid or very easily becomes liquid. And they'd learned how to extract mercury from cinnabar. In fact, in the book, I also talk about recent experiments by chemists.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. That's fascinating stuff.
Well, they've actually found that, for example, in cold and hot extractions of mercury from cinnabar, the original Greek writings gave information that was not known to contemporary science.
And that's amazing.
The importance, for example, of heating the cinnabar in an iron vessel. Turns out that the iron's critical to the quality of the extraction. And that's written into these early documents, but you won't find it in contemporary. So, in fact, they obviously had knowledge that in some areas that we don't have today. I mean, these recipes are not all quite like a recipe for making ratatouille or an omelette or something like that. Take 2 eggs. They're very similar, but very often I think they were keeping certain facts out of it, or they presumed. They're more like notes on recipes rather than first do this, then do that, then do that. It's presumed that, I think these were aide-mémoire. These were to stimulate the memory of the operator who'd already would have been shown how to do these things. But teaching in those days was always very hands-on. A master or mistress showed you what to do, and you had to remember. And I think these recipes were to help you remember. And of course, the trade would have had secrets as well. They wouldn't write everything down necessarily.
Right. So in reading your book, one might come away thinking that the idea is that alchemy was actually a practical art, and then people began to incorrectly read too much into it, too much abstraction, too much spirituality. And I'm just curious, because it's always, I've been reading your work for a long time, and it's clear to me that you're a scholar, but you're also a seeker yourself. And so how do you perceive alchemy now that you see how this evolved? Do you see the spiritual insights as being like legitimate in any way, or is it
yeah, very much so?
Okay.
Yeah, I think so, because I mean, before I investigated alchemy separately, am I coming through?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Before I investigated, I've been drenched a lot of years in the 1980s and 90s in the Rosicrucian tradition, and I found that the use of alchemical imagery for describing the enlightenment of the soul very helpful. There is, I think Zosimos is right, that if you observe natural processes, there is a spiritual analog all the time, and that the certain scientists have that gift to see that, and certain scientists just simply see it as in an objective manner, as we say, as objects, doing things with objects. Other people are sensitive to meaning. When we're talking about the spiritual development of man, we are talking about something that is invisible in its essence, but which affects the world. A spiritually enlightened person will make an impact on the world, even if you can't see the wind that blows in the sail. So the use of alchemical imagery, I think, is a legitimate aspect of the history of the science. All these phases of alchemy have something to say. They may not say they're not saying much about how to dye a statue gold or silver, or how to change its color, etc. They're not saying much about that, if anything at all, and they probably wouldn't understand that. But they've caught on to this idea of nature as a divine analogy. There's a very famous book with that as a title, written in the 18th century, which was a huge hit with religious and pious people, because it enabled you to you can come up with any hypothesis or theory about the universe, but that doesn't alter what it means to us. As spiritual beings, the universe is communicating something to us other than the light of the spectrum or its radiation computation or the numerical aspect. And other than the quantitative aspect of the universe, there is a meaning for us. And that meaning might change in its language, but it's fundamental to the way we are. And we develop spiritually through an we can develop spiritually through an engagement with what we call, or as John Lennon used to say, what we laughably call the real world. So yeah, I don't. When I look at alchemy, to answer your question more directly, I see a rainbow of possibilities of ways not only of thinking about alchemy, but of science in general. But I do think it's very important to put alchemy back into the science and the science back into the alchemy.
Right. I mean, it's incredible that I would try to wrap my head around the fact that, like you said, was the University of Bologna, I think it was, in Italy.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, Martelli's team. Yeah.
So they find reactions in chemistry that had hitherto been unknown.
Yeah.
And yet this stuff popped out of Egypt. It's just so bizarre. It makes me wonder how much other solid like materialist science and knowledge has been lost over the years. Like how many other things did they know that we don't know now?
Oh, well, I think at the beginning of the book, I give an example. When I was taught for a time, I went to a lecture given by a famous English Egyptologist when I was 17, and he said, we all like evidence, and science particularly likes evidence. But he says, when it comes to history, our evidential basis is as follows. And he gave the image of, imagine a whole load of piles of books and objects put in a vast fireplace and set fire to and burn, and stuff going up the chimney. He said, what you end up with when the fire's gone out on the carpet in front of you, that is the nature of our scientific evidence. Which, in other words, one thing I've always found slightly annoying about historical epics and films is when people see films like Ben-Hur or whatever it is, or Quo Vadis, or any historical movie recreation, especially of the distant past, the screen is always full. I'd love to do a historical film where the screen had lots of holes in that, and somebody could say, why is that the hole? It says, well, that's the bit we don't know.
Right.
you could do a very interesting sort of theoretical something kind of thing Jean-Luc Godard would have liked to turn that idea into a movie where somebody starts saying something and then the screen goes silent, and they say, "Why has it gone silent? We don't know what he would have said there."
Oh man, yeah, that needs to be done. And
No,
that's a weird thought too, because also with tarot cards too, like there's always been talk about tarot cards. Remember a couple years ago there was something found in a text or something like that. I can't remember the specifics, but it totally rearranged what we know about tarot cards. And it's just amazing how there's so little evidence for the past that one single fragment of a document can rearrange how we see a whole continuity.
But there is one saving grace in this picture of lost knowledge, and that is that the human imagination hasn't fundamentally changed, in my view, in 2,000 years. So when you get greater understanding through constant engagement and through honest seeking, not reputation seeking, not pride seeking, honest engagement, things happen in your mind where you can see through their eyes, just maybe for a second. Maybe something of that past comes through. And the power of the imagination, of course, can be abused very easily. You can merely imagine, oh, you're just imagining it. Yes, but in order to write good history and good philosophy, you have to have an imagination, because you've got to have a mind meeting their mind. If your mind is not meeting the mind you're studying, you have really nothing to say, and that goes with the universe as well. Is the Hermetic Hermes Trismegistus texts are saying this: the universe is mind, it's all mind. So if you don't have that engagement, many books I read, I can tell the person has merely acquired a memory of knowledge, but not the knowledge. That's the difference between gnosis and ordinary science. Gnosis is an engagement direct with mind to mind. Ordinary knowledge you can remember. Sometimes it's very difficult for me to do interviews because I've maybe written 1 or 2 books between the time of the interview, and I can't remember everything that's in a book and all the rest of it. That's why I write the book, so it's there for you to pass it on. I don't have to remember it because it's in the book. Right. But if the interview's a good one, like this one, I find just it's possible to re-enter the mind, and I come out with things that maybe I didn't even realize before, or images and so forth. So it's, people talk about objectivity, and a friend of mine once startled me by the statement when I was a student: the world is full of objects. Just think about that. The world is full of objects. Meditate on that phrase. The world is full of objects. It's actually a very fascinating idea. And by the end of your meditation, you'll come to wonder exactly whether it's true or not.
So, all right,
in other words, I'm talking about what people call objective knowledge, and then this horrible phrase that's abused, subjective knowledge, which they'll say, well, that's your opinion. Well, it may indeed be my opinion. It may be also something that I know.
Right.
You could call it what you like, but I know it, Right. Or I've begun to understand it, which is more to the thing. That's what my books are all meant to do, is to initiate or encourage this process of understanding. So much of the knowledge that's coming through on the internet and through especially 24-hour news, where more is less, more is less, more is less. The simplistic things that people are yapping all the time, the reaction of politicians to events, quick phrases, sound bites, all this shows total lack of willingness to understand anything. And if our world is going to disappear into a carbonized lump, it will be because we didn't bother to use the power we have to understand things, and we didn't engage with the mind, and it's up to us to do so. So,
man, that'd be a fantastic place to close this, because that's a great bit of wisdom. But I have to ask one more question. So right now there's probably few people in the world who have spent their life as immersed in these topics of the esoteric, spirituality, religion. You dedicated your career, your adult life to it, written all of these books. And I just want to ask, if you're talking to a young seeker today, somebody who feels this call to find the truth in this materialistic world where it's so hard to believe in that pull, what would your advice to them be, to a young person who wants to set out and start exploring reality?
Never give up. And if you do, get back quick. But always remember there is a price for everything one undertakes, and sacrifices have to be made from time to time. And to make a sacrifice means to make sacred. You've got to give your life to it. You've got to lay your whole life on the altar and be prepared for what comes. If your motives are not of the right kind, we all get tempted, and sometimes we give in, etc. We can always repent, or turn back again to the right path. We learn through our mistakes. But my advice to anybody is, ask yourself seriously whether it's truth you really want. If it is, go for it. But don't be surprised at the result, because that will also teach you a great deal about the nature. Truth is an unwelcome guest at the table of the world. Most people who've been killed for things is usually because they told the truth to somebody who didn't want to hear it. So it's not necessarily going to be an easy time, but then the rewards are profound, and but they're not always obvious. But I would say absolutely, what used to be called the great work is the transformation of the soul. That's one of the images that's come out of this alchemical tradition, which is very important. And the better the metal, the more it gets beaten. You want to make steel has to be tempered. So you've got to be prepared for a degree of suffering, in the full faith that you will never be completely abandoned, though there will be moments when you feel you are. But I've talked about the painful aspect. I haven't talked nearly enough about the joys. The joy of knowledge, the gai savoir, should never. There is a wonderful sense. Occasionally, you get it when you're studying, when you get that definite aroma of truth, and it is beautiful. And that's the kind of reward you're going to enjoy. Somebody once said, it was Dean Ing, actually, Dean William Ralph Ing, Dean of St. Paul's, who wrote that the penalty for being a bad man is to be a bad man. And that's what the bad men don't understand. So if you want to be a truthful man, the joy of it, the penalty for being a truthful man is that you at least will know the truth. Not the whole of it, maybe, but you'll have a sense of the whole.
Man, I couldn't have dreamed a better answer than that, man. Thank you so much. That's a perfect. Thank you, man.
My pleasure.
So, are there last thing? Are there any other projects you would like to fill people in on that you have coming up?
Well, my next year will appear my study of the Book of Enoch and the whole tradition of the reception of the Book of Enoch, and it's called The Amazing Books of Enoch. I might have the title Beyond the Universe, because that's what it's really talking about, beyond the universe. The Amazing Books of Enoch, the origin of Jewish mysticism, and that's right, Enoch, pioneer of Jewish mysticism and the origins of Christianity. And after that book, I don't think I've got anything left to say in a book.
Really? You're coming to the end?
I certainly, I don't know what you mean by the end, but
well, the end of writing. Yeah.
All I can say is I wouldn't, what's that film? Never Say Never Again. I feel I've covered everything that's ever really interested me. I'm not saying that everything that is of interest. There are things that interest other people. I, for example, would never write about astrology. in detail because I'm not an astrologer, and I don't think I have enough sympathetic knowledge of it. It would take too long to acquire, and I don't have the urge to. Likewise, I wouldn't write about tarot cards for the same reason. I don't feel I'm sufficiently acquainted to write a book about it. I mean, I've written about tarot, I've written about astrology. There's a lot of it comes up in my books. But to make that my sole subject, I'd like to be authoritative, and I can't be authoritative if I'm dependent on other authorities. You know, it's got to be part of my search. So I've always wanted to understand the origins of Christianity and the meanings of it. But I'm not going to compete on Christian doctrines or ethics, because I think there's millions of books on these subjects. The ethics of Christianity is too well trodden ground. We're not bad because we lack knowledge of Christian ethics. We're bad because we ignore our knowledge of Christian ethics. But the books are there if you want them. And obviously, I've always enjoyed writing about the Bible and anything that relates to it. There's always interested me. It seems to me a wonderfully rewarding mine, as long as you approach it in your own truly in your own way, but with good knowledge base, which is being added to all the time. People say that line, "There's nothing new under the sun," and it's true that everything has been made, everything has probably been thought fundamentally, but the picture becomes different with different kinds of knowledge coming in. So we can't, how can I say, if I write about the Bible now, it's not the book I could have written in 1850, because there were so many assumptions about the Bible then that we don't share today or don't see in the same way. So I might go back to some of those sort of things, but honestly, I think the Book of Enoch book ought to be sufficient. I quote Ecclesiastes, of making many books there is no end, and with much knowledge cometh great sorrow. And I know that's true. but I'm a writer. I'm supposed to write, and I'm a bit surprised that I've sort of reached a point where nothing compels me at the moment to write about. But if somebody came to me and said, "I would like you to write about this," that would interest me. That's some of the books I've written have come that way. Somebody said, "Oh, but what about that?" And I thought, that's a good, interesting idea. And I said, "Well, do you think people would like to read about that?" "Oh, yes." I was like, "Okay, well, I'll give it some thought and see what happens." And if I get that bing sense that, this is going to be an interesting journey, I'm going to get somewhere with this, then I would write about it. I think at the moment I'm sort of a bit exhausted. Exhausted's pretty good. I feel I've exhausted at least for now.
Right.
And I don't write books for the sake of it. Some horrible person in Australia described me as prolific, as if it was something to be ashamed of.
Really?
He's written so many books. Well, they can't be any good then, because he's written so many of them. Man, I sweat over my books. That's what I do, and I don't see what's wrong with producing a book every year. I mean, if I was a band, I would want an album out every year and a single. Why shouldn't I produce a book every year?
People have said the same thing about Stephen King. There's always going to be people that want to chop down the successful, man. I think that's just like human nature.
You're right, but it can be quite hurtful, even if it's an idiot criticizing you. Even if you know they're wrong, of course. Very often these things now they're printed on the internet and they stay up. If somebody makes a comment, I don't mind that. They can say what they like and I can answer it. But if they've printed something and people around the world read that, and they've read that before they see something I've done, then it's like those awful reviews you get on Amazon. Somebody doesn't like you, on goes their review. It's ill-considered, but somebody coming fresh to the subject reads that and might be put off. I sometimes am put off things because the reviews aren't very good.
Mhm.
Not that I believe the review, but it sort of darkens the vision a bit. Although if you're looking for something, you trust your own judgment always.
Right. Well, from my counter perspective, before I sign off and let you go, is that I'm grateful that you've shared your journey in your books, and we've all benefited from it. So I think that perspective is just foolish, and I'm grateful that you've put all this out there, because those of us who don't have the resources or the time to delve as deep as you do, we get you bring it to us. So it's
Well, that's fantastic, Jeff. I'd really very, very much appreciate that.